And what we're doing now is recording this webinar so that it can be posted to the web afterwards, and you'll have access to it at any time. Okay, or you can let your colleagues know who haven't been able to attend. Okay, so let me go back to the first slide now that we're recording and say here's what we're presenting today. It's using the Accreditation Handbook. And this is for anybody who is an educator preparation provider who's going to host a visit in fall 2016 or later. And this is the first in a series of webinars designed especially to meet your needs. Okie doke. Here's our goal today. And our goal is really to dig in to the Accreditation Handbook, go through it sort of section by section, and what I'll be doing throughout that handbook as I make this presentation is to point out areas of information that are new, parts of the Accreditation Handbook that I think are particularly useful, things that I think you should really pay close attention to, okay? And then address any future webinars. If we've got a webinar upcoming that's going to dig into a particular aspect that's in the Accreditation Handbook, dig in a little deeper, I will point it out and make known to you what that date and time is. And those announcements will come at the end. Under next steps, we'll tell you when the webinar topics will be announced, okay? So I want to point out here, I hope you all have a copy of the latest Accreditation Manual. I've asked one of the CAPE folks on hand here if anybody does not have a copy of the latest Accreditation Handbook, where they might find it. I know it is accessible on the website and accessible through AIMS. So hopefully you have a copy in front of you. Great, so let's get started. On part one, we have an overview of CAPE and its processes. That's the whole entire first section. And in that section, there are a number of subsections, and I'll be talking about those specifically as we go along. Much of what's contained in the overview, which is on page 5 to 12, is also in the commission report. And I've got access. Your mission report can be accessed on CAPEnet, and I've got the live link here. One of the things that is apparent in the overview is that this early instrument evaluation is optional. And at one time, I think it was, it may have been announced that this was going to be a required portion of the CAPE process. It will not be. It's an optional service that CAPE will provide if you'd like to, up to 3 years in advance of submitting your self-study or in advance of hosting your visit. You can submit your own assessments for review, and we'll go into that a little bit deeper a little later in the webinar. Okay, David has just informed me that you also, if you go into your AIMS space, log into AIMS, you will find under Resources a copy of the Accreditation Handbook, and the pages that I'm referring to throughout this webinar will correspond to that copy of the handbook that's in AIMS for you. Okay, and as you can see, we're going to have a webinar on April 21st at 1 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, that'll dig in a little deeper into the early instrument evaluation. And you'll be able to ask a lot of questions about that. I'll have the latest information about what's involved, what you should include, what you should not include, and hopefully answer any questions. The second part of the Accreditation Handbook addresses the standards and some additional materials about the standards. These are on pages 13 to 23 of the handbook. These are the initial standards in their entirety from the commission report. And what's good about it is that it's right there in the handbook, and so you've got easy access to those standards without having to go either to the full commission report or to the CAPE website to find the standards. So it's included right there in the handbook. These are the initial standards. If you want the advanced standards, they're very, very similar to the initial standards, but those can be accessed through the CAPE website. They're easily acceptable under the standards. New in the standards are that an EPP must meet component 3.2 on selectivity. And if you go into your Accreditation Handbook on page 18, you'll see where that's stated. Okay, and you'll find a following statement on page 19 that says that originally CAPE on Standard 3.2 was going to have a phase-in period. Okay, and the phase-in read something. Let me get into my Standard 3 here. The phase-in related to when you had to have certain CAPE minimums. Okay, and those are not going to be implemented. CAPE has appointed a commission to look into the implementation of these various options on Standard 3.2, and those are not going to be implemented until that commission has come out with its report. So 3.2 standard said that your students had to be in the top 50% of the applicants, okay, between 2016 and 2017, 50% on nationally normed tests, and in the top 40% in 2018, in the top 33% by 2020. And so this is the portion that right now is suspended until this commission has an opportunity to meet. We will be presenting, or I'll be presenting webinars on each of your standards from September 10th through September 18th. We'll dig into Standard 1 deeply. We'll also align it with not only what the CAPE standard says, but also what the evidence for those standards, what evidence is recommended. And we'll dig into the evidence a little further on here in the handbook. But there'll be a consolidation of what appears in the evidence guide and what appears in the CAPE handbook regarding the standards. Okay? All right. Let's move on to Part 3. I think that this part, the accreditation process, the application, and the eligibility, it appears on pages 25 to 39. There are 8 separate areas of interest, and I'll go briefly into those areas, each one of those areas. Then starting with the application and eligibility. Already there's been some confusion, because CAPE is a new organization, about whether or not everybody has to submit an application and become eligible, as opposed to one of the others. Hello? Okay, you can still hear me. Okay. So there's been some confusion about that, and I want to clarify, and the CAPE handbook does clarify that submitting applications and determining eligibility is only applicable for those of you who are applying for accreditation for the very first time. If you've been accredited by either NCAID or TIAC, then you do not need to submit an application. Okay, and another question that has come up . My volume has decreased. Okay. How's that? Thank you, folks, for, I see anyone else have gray blocks over part of the words on the screen? Okay. I don't know. Let me go here and see if I move these items that I've got open on my screen. I've got the chat open and the participants open, and I'll move those over slightly, and hopefully that will help you with the gray blots so that they disappear. People have said that my volume decreased. I hope that my volume is back on fully. I've taken it up as high as it'll go. Okay. Somebody else was not able to hear anything when they went in. They got disconnected. Try again. Have them call you back. If you go to the top of your screen on the green pull down, you can click on teleconference and enter it and enter again. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the capacity tables. There's been some confusion about the capacity tables as well. Capacity tables are related to the United States Department of Education's requirements for all accreditors that are recognized by the Department of Education. And these capacity tables are not part of our standards any longer. They were part of NCAID standards when it came to Standard 6 under Facilities and Resources and Budgets. They were also part of CAPE Standard 5, where it asked about faculty qualifications. And as you know, neither one of those standards appear in the CAPE standards. Therefore, to comply with the United States Department of Ed, those have been moved into tables. the application process for people applying to CAPE for first-time accreditation. However, those capacities were going to be confirmed for accuracy as part, okay, everybody says that's better, thank you. Okay, so the capacity tables were going to be confirmed for accuracy by each of you at 2 points in the CAPE process. One, they were going to be updated as part of your self-study. And so I believe that is continuing, although implementation is temporarily suspended until United States Department of Education recognition is sought. Okay, so you will fill out those capacity tables if you're a first-time accreditation person, and as part of your annual report, you will find that you are to confirm the accuracy of 4 of those tables. And to access those tables, you can go into AIMS. If you click on Accreditation Process, you'll see a section called Data Management pop up, and you can click on that. And those 4 tables, there's your profile, there's your contact information, a couple other things that you can update as part of your self-study and as part of your annual report. Okay, so that's the first area of interest that is in Section 3 on the accreditation process. The second area of interest is this early review of assessments and scoring guides. It appears on pages 27 and 28 of that accreditation process section. And again, what's new here is that this is voluntary. It is not a requirement to submit your assessments for review by CAPE in advance of submitting your self-study. However, if you were to do that, and I certainly think it's a great idea to do it, is because you will get feedback on the quality of your assessments, and what you would submit are only those that you have created or made for yourself. You don't submit proprietary evidence, and the Accreditation Handbook goes into that. You would supply all assessments for all different program areas, but you do not supply any data. And the questions that you'll answer if you do submit early review of assessments is how they were developed, how your quality of those assessments has been determined. So think about, your reliability, your validity, your relevance, and what criteria for success have you established. So, for example, if you have a 5-point rubric, is 3 the acceptable level for candidate performance? And if so, how did you determine or establish that that would be your criteria for success? There will be 2 due dates of April 1st and October 1st to submit those early assessments. And we're going to present another webinar on the early assessment process on Tuesday, April 21st at 1 o'clock. If you're interested in that option, and, well, even if you're not interested, you're not sure yet if you're interested or what, please join us on April 21st. Okay, the third part of this section, or the third area of interest for Part 3 on the accreditation process, talks about what pathway you're going to pursue as part of your accreditation. You'll notice that you have 3 options, and that CI, which used to be continuous improvement, has been renamed as SI, or selective improvement, since all EPPs are expected as part of CAPE accreditation to be engaged in the continuous improvement of their programs and their performance of their candidates. It became redundant to also call a pathway continuous improvement. So it's been changed to selective improvement. There's brief overviews of each one of those pathways: selective improvement, inquiry brief, or transformation initiative on pages 28 and page 29. However, if you go into Section 4 of the handbook, and that's from pages 41 to 78, you will find much lengthier descriptions of each one of those pathways, so that if you're in a place where you're not sure which pathway you want to pursue, I would highly recommend you go into pages 41 through 78 and look at what's available to you. The inquiry brief pathway starts on page 41. Selective improvement starts on page 53, and transformation initiative starts on 65. And what you'll find in there are really detailed guidelines that include the processes, the timelines for preparing your self-studies. There are rubrics available for evaluating either your selective improvement or your transformation initiative plans. There's a rubric for the TI proposal process and for writing the self-study for each one of the pathways. And there's lots and lots of good information in those detailed guidelines in Part 4. Okay, just checking my little board here. There we go. All right, so the self-study process itself is discussed on pages 29 through 31 of Part 3, the accreditation process. What I believe is most important in this particular section that you should pay some attention to is the box on page 29. It shows an important shift, I think, in CAPE policy, which is that the EPP is responsible for the quality of their data. And so that's an important consideration for you to have. And there are a number of webinars that will be forthcoming that talk about how to select the evidence that you'll be submitting, how to represent that evidence, how to make choices about what to include and what not to include. You're responsible for the quality of that evidence. Now, evidence also, it points out in that box on page 29 that evidence is submitted by component and that you provide a holistic narrative about that collection of evidence by standard. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Again, you must meet component 3.2 on selectivity at admission and all 4 components of standard 4, as well as components 5.3 and 5.4 to be fully accredited. This is important for those of you continuing your accreditation. We'll look at accreditation decisions in a moment, but as you're preparing your self-study, pay particular attention to these 3.2, 5.3, and 5.4 are the only individual components that must be met in order to meet CAPE standards, as well as the 4 components of Standard 4. And then, finally, that box points out that visitor teams are going to assess the quality of evidence in support of the standards and identify strengths as well as deficiencies. And I believe CAPE is calling those weaknesses and stipulations at this point. So you will not find your visiting team recommending standards as being met or unmet, but you will find them identifying those strengths and those deficiencies. The next part of the Part 3 of the accreditation process and the continuation of self-study part discusses online evidence and tagging, and that the evidence phase-in for CAPE accepts submissions of plans through 2017. So there's a great chart on page 83, which is later on in the Accreditation Handbook, that shows you that phase-in and what can be submitted. The plans or the submission of plans is also discussed on page 31. In lieu of data that you don't have available to you, you can talk about what plans you're making to get that data. And the related webinars on this whole part, this whole section of the self-study process, as you can see. On June 16th, we'll talk about writing these plans for self-study submissions. This will not include writing plans for selective improvement or for transformational initiatives. It will discuss within the standards where data and evidence is required. If that evidence is not available at this time, what should a plan about collecting that evidence look like? So that's on June 16th. On July 6th, we're going to look at planning evidence submissions. July 15th, we're going to look at the self-study evidence questions. What should you be prepared to answer? And on December 15th, we'll have a specific session on how to tag and summarize the evidence of a self-study. I hope you'll find those related webinars very helpful to you. Okay, moving right along, specialty and license area review. The handbook on page 31 through 33 discusses this. What's new here? Well, let me start with SPA submissions. SPAs, for those of you familiar with the CAPE process, means Specialty Professional Associations, and such as the National Council of Teachers of English or the National Science Teachers Association. You must submit to those associations if your state requires it as part of the state partnership agreement. I can speak to New York State in the past required that instead of the state reviewing your programs individually at one point, they did require colleges to submit all of their programs for which there was a specialty professional association to that association for review. So you want to check your state partnership agreements, or you want to ask other EPPs in your state what they're doing, or call the state and find out what they're requiring. The new part of these program submissions is that program review with feedback, a new process that CAPE offered, is now going to be obtained or possible by disaggregating your data by program area for Standard 1. So again, if your state is in a partnership agreement that allows program review with feedback, then that is something that you can do right in the body of your self-study without worrying about submitting your program reviews for review by specialty professional associations up to 3 years in advance of your site visit. You can look at a great chart on pages 32 and 33 that goes into who does what and when. That's a very helpful chart. Okay. Okay, cross-cutting themes. As you may know, there are 2 cross-cutting themes that were adopted by the CAPE Commission and then adopted by the Board of Directors, which are diversity and technology. And the Commission report can be accessed on the CAPE website. I'll show you where. So you can review some of the language that was in the Commission report on those cross-cutting themes. These themes must be tagged in your evidence. So as you're uploading some evidence, let's say you're uploading a chart on your grade point averages for admitted students. No, that wouldn't make sense given this, but yes, you could, exactly. Because you're going to show, let's say, the diversity of your candidates in that chart as well, as you're going to disaggregate it for, let's say, race and ethnicity. Then you might also tag that to the diversity standard. Okay? However, you should know that both of the cross-cutting themes, as pointed out in the Accreditation Handbook, are not going to be judged as standards because they are not standards. So what visiting teams will do is review the evidence you've uploaded regarding diversity and technology and make recommendations for improvement. However, the Accreditation Handbook points out that those recommendations for improvement could be red flags in some cases, which could impact your standards, but more details about that have really not been revealed, and that's something that we'll dig into in webinars on December 3rd and on December 15th as we look at diversity and technology as separate sections. But for one way to think about this is, as you know, technology is also part of Standard 1. Standard 1.6 relates directly to technology. So if your cross-cutting theme is showing you to be weak in technology, that could, in fact, impact that component and consequently Standard 1. Okay. The formative review, this is the next area of interest as part of the accreditation process, appears on page 34 to 37, and there are 5 steps outlined about what is reviewed and what is reported and decided as part of the CAPE process. There's really good information for you about what the Pathway Commissions and the Accreditation Council processes include. So as your accreditation, as your site visit team leaves your campus and submits their report, and the Accreditation Council comes to meet, whether that's a few months later or 6 months later, and they review all these documents, this helps you to understand the role that that formative review will have as the Commission looks at the evidence, the reports, and information that have been submitted, and then how that folds up to the Accreditation Council as it makes a decision for you about accreditation. The visiting team, as noted earlier, is going to identify strengths and deficiencies in the self-study to date, and they will comment on the strengths of the evidence at the formative process, which, as I have described earlier to someone, it's sort of a no harm, no foul part of the process. It simply indicates to you in advance of their being on campus what they see currently as the strengths and deficiencies in your report, and the formative report has an opportunity for you to respond to that, to provide additional information, to clarify some of the points that they may have raised. And so it's a great way to have an interchange, an exchange of information. If you also look on the pathways chart in Section 4 of the Accreditation Handbook, it appears for IB on page 41, for selective improvement on page 54, and for transformation initiative on page 67, you'll also see where the formative review appears in the process for you and how it is responded to. I did want to point out that a new item, a new policy for CAPE is that there is a possibility to delay your site visit based on the visiting team's review at this stage in the process. So the formative review could be such that the visiting team says, we don't think you're quite ready yet, and that there may be a delay of visit suggested. And let me go on to the next slide. I'm getting a couple of, okay. We're almost done with those 8 sections of interest as part of Part 3 of the accreditation process. And this is important. It was related to something I said earlier about the standards and components that needed to be met. For continuing accreditation, you have to meet all standards to be accredited for 7 years. For conditional accreditation, which is a 2-year accreditation only, there can only be one standard unmet. So let's think, for example, what was reported earlier. If you do not meet component 3.2, then you cannot meet standard 3. And not meeting standard 3 would result in conditional accreditation. Okay? So if there's more than one standard met, and let's say you don't meet standard 4's components, and you don't meet standard 3.2, that's more than one standard, and your accreditation will be revoked. Now, in the past, or at least for the NCAPE part of the process, you could fail to meet 2 to 3 standards and get a revisit, a full accreditation or a partial revisit. But this CAPE standard is a little higher in the sense that more than one standard fails means your accreditation will be revoked. For those going for initial first-time accreditation, they must meet all standards, and they don't have an opportunity to not meet one of the standards and still be accredited, although for limited time. So that appears on pages 38 and 39 of the Accreditation Handbook. All right. It also discusses the annual report. It appears on page 39. An annual report is required of all people who are, or EBBs, who have continuing first-time or even eligibility established. An accreditation annual report is required. It's greatly reduced if you're simply in the process of establishing eligibility. It is reduced if you are in the process of your accreditation process for the first time. And it is reduced under certain other circumstances. When you've had a recent accreditation visit, then the annual report is adjusted for that. You will see an Appendix B on page 115 on those requirements and what CAPE reviews regarding the annual report. You can also go to the CAPE website and click on that link, and you can download the technical guide and the template for the 2015 annual report. So just know that if you don't submit your annual reports, you're going to get some reminders, but it can lead to revocation if you're reminded and reminded again and you still don't submit an annual report. So the Accreditation Handbook points that out. So Part 4 of the report, we're done with Part 3 on the accreditation process and the 8 areas of interest. So Part 4, that extends from pages 41 to 78, delves into the processes for each one of the accreditation pathways. As mentioned earlier, there's the inquiry brief pathway, and the information about that pathway begins on page 41. The selective improvement begins on page 53, and the transformation initiative pathway starts on page 65. There are really good detailed guidelines about those processes and the timelines for submitting your self-studies. Again, there are rubrics available to you in the Accreditation Handbook for how CAPE will review your selective improvement and transformation initiative plans. There's a lengthy description of the transformation initiative proposal process, and there are descriptive details about writing the self-study for each one of those pathways. I'm not going to get into a discussion of the individual pathways at this point because it's just an overview of the handbook, but I suggest that you dig into those. The CAPE conference provides wonderful workshops for each one of these pathways to dig into writing your self-study. So as you go about attending CAPE conferences perhaps and updating your knowledge, I suggest you attend these individual workshops that will give you hands-on experience and answers in writing the self-study for those pathways. Let's put bells and whistles on this particular slide because it deals with Appendix A. And Appendix A provides examples of evidence. As you can see, it goes from pages 79 to 114. And there are two separate pieces here that I'd like to point out and draw your attention to. There is a range of evidence in a table on pages 81 to 83 that I strongly suggest you spend some time with. They categorize evidence as the sort of usual, most common kinds of evidence that are available for a particular component. And that's what I think is helpful here. And it also discusses what is new or different that might be submitted as evidence under this component. And right now I'm going to flip over to that table myself. And I've got the CAPE handbook available. It's not showing up top here. Okay. Okay. And for example, some of the usual measures that appear for Component 1.1 include provider-created measures such as instruments assessing observations and lesson plans, portfolios, etc. But other examples of new and different measures include provider end of major projects and demonstrations, end of course, key course tests, certain GRE fields and ETS major field tests. So I think this is helpful as you go to think about what are the kinds of evidence that you would submit under particular components. This section is particularly helpful. Okay. Next, the evidence chart that appears on page 88. I'm leafing through it right now. Okay. chart. And I think this is probably one of the strongest and most useful items in the Accreditation Handbook itself. First of all, because it goes systematically by standard and component. So at the very tippy top in a dark yellow border, you'll find your standard 1 that's highlighted. These are the standards that you will respond to holistically. Then it gets into the components. And under each component, it has 3 categories of information. The measure or the type of information that might be submitted. Then how those measures are going to be reviewed. And last of all, how the accreditation review is going to proceed. So for example, it breaks it down into the early assessment part of the process. So if you submit assessments and scoring guides for early review, how is that going to be reviewed by CAPE? Then it tells you how the off-site review, what kind of information you'll get, and then finally for the on-site review. And I think it's extremely helpful to look at this particular evidence chart as it goes through each and every one of your standards, each and every one of the components, because it's very specific and will be most helpful to you as you think about what evidence to submit, whether they're your own evidence, whether they're state evidence, are they licensure measures. The second column, for example, gives you the feedback for how that will be reviewed on provider-created measures, how they will look at state-created measures, how they will looking at licensure information. And so you can, from this, you can glean what might be the strongest evidence to submit and what might constitute the multiple measures that CAPE would be looking for. Right? Okay, it does also refer to the evidence guide. Okay? The evidence guide is a separate document, also available on the CAPE website. And we will be, our next webinar, which is scheduled for April 1st at 5 p.m. Whoops, it's going too far. We'll provide an overview of the evidence guide. So we'll look at that very carefully. Again, the webinars on each one of the standards that will occur from September 10th through September 18th will also address these evidence examples, standard by standard. So as we spend time digging into Standard 2, for example, we'll look specifically at what are the pieces of evidence that CAPE considers common, what are some of the new pieces of evidence that it might look for, and how are those evidence submissions going to be evaluated by CAPE. And then last of all, in this section, on pages 87 and 88, right before the evidence table, there's another couple of paragraphs, I guess, that make a statement about addressing the cross-cutting themes, where you're going to need to incorporate technology for standard 1, 2, and 3, and then how you would address that as an overall cross-cutting theme statement. Okay? So for the Accreditation Handbook, that's a pretty solid overview of the information that's contained in it. There is a glossary at the very back of the Accreditation Handbook. It starts on page 114. That glossary is helpful if you wonder for yourself, well, what do they mean by completer, for example? Or what does Accreditation Council mean? What does a commission mean? What are the differences? You can go right to the Accreditation Handbook and find what each of those definitions are. You can find their definition for a ceiling or a floor. You can find their definition for a benchmark. All of these terms that appear throughout the handbook and or in the evidence guide are contained in this glossary. So it's a good reference point for you. Okay, now we've got a good, 15 minutes or more for people to ask any questions you'd like. So feel free to speak up, to send us something on the chat. Anybody? I'll be quiet for just a few more minutes here. Okay. So here's what we've got. We've got next steps in terms of this webinar was recorded and will be available by early next week on the CAPE website. I assume you will find that under resources. If CAPE staffers are online and can clarify, please do. Our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, April 1st at 5 p.m., and the topic will be an overview of the evidence guide. You can find the evidence guide from your Ames location, and it is available on the CAPE website under the accreditation processes. If you click on that, you'll find the guidelines to the self-study and evidence, and you can click on the evidence guide for the most recent copy. I understand that Scott is going to be producing the calendar or schedule of future webinars. However, a reminder of the webinar, the topic, and I lost 2 letters, and link, will be sent out by CAPE 2 weeks in advance. So you should be hearing from the communications staff that will outline what's the upcoming webinar and how to log in. The password will not change, however, the login link will, and so we'll be sending out a new link every time we have a new webinar coming up. So I am going to stay on the line here for the next 15 minutes or so. If anybody has questions and would like to ask them to me or to any CAPE staffers that are online, please do. Otherwise, this webinar for today is concluded. I hope you find it helpful. And if not, I encourage you to send me an email and tell me it wasn't very helpful and what you'd like for me to do differently next time. Thank you all. Bye-bye. I see some folks still online. Good. Feel free to speak up if you have a question or a comment. Okay. Oh, yay. I see a question come in on the chat. If accreditation is revoked, what, if any, option is available for the institution? Great question. You have an option to appeal the accreditation decision, and the CAPE Policy Manual describes this in some detail. There is an appeals committee, which is part of the board of directors. And what you would do when you get a letter of revocation from CAPE headquarters, it will tell you how much time you have to let them know that you intend to appeal the revocation. In the case that you do appeal, the revocation does not become effective until the appeal is concluded. Okay? So your accreditation remains in force until that entire appeals process has been completed. So the appeals process has some very distinct and specific guidelines. And again, those are available in the CAPE Policy Manual, which is available on the CAPE website at this time. Thank you for your question. Let me see if we have any others. are capacity elements to be addressed in this year's annual report? The answer to that question is right at the very beginning of the annual report. It does say, confirm that this information is accurate. That is referring to some of those preliminary capacity tables that I told you about. The profile, for example, the contact information, the programs that are in your that are available to candidates in your EPP, and your program characteristics. So those 4 capacity tables, they didn't appear on your annual report, but it did ask you to confirm that those tables are accurate. And again, if you want to see what those tables are, go into your AIM system, go to the accreditation part, click on Accreditation Process, and Data Management will come up. Click on that, and you can get into those 4 tables to check for accuracy. Let's see. Oh, wonderful. Someone told me that it is called selected improvement, not selective improvement, and I am grateful for that correction. And I was notified by CAPE staff that there are 30 days. You have 30 days in which to notify CAPE offices that you will be appealing your accreditation decision. So thank you for that. Anybody else? I'm loving these questions coming in. I see we have some more folks online still. I'm going to scroll down. I see a hand raised. Carolyn, I'm going to take you off mute. Did you have another question?
I did. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, you mentioned rather quickly about how the process is for ensuring or for noting that an institution has not completed one or more standards successfully. And I noticed that in the past, and I know the past is the past, but the past continuous improvement models, it seemed like there were quite a few institutions that would have, 2 standards that were not completely addressed. It wasn't uncommon. It wasn't uncommon. So it would seem like there would be, if we were following a similar process for review, it would seem like there would be an awful lot of people have their in-CAPE revoked, or their CAPE at that time revoked. Is there a different procedure that's being presented to the teams for the review process?
Okay. I think what needs to be an important thought related to that, Carolyn, is that many of those failed standards had to do with Standard 4 in diversity.
Yes.
Over the years, and that no longer is a standard, and it is simply the cross-cutting theme, which can result in recommendations, but it cannot fail you any longer. Okay? So okay, so you can't be failed on diversity because it's not being judged as a standard. Okay, so I would say easily half would be off the top of my head of the folks who did not meet 2 or more standards had diversity as one of the failed standards. Okay?
I would agree.
Okay, and the other 2 standards would have been in Standard 1 and Standard 2, which were candidate knowledge, skills, and dispositions, as well as the assessment system. And usually, since those went hand in hand, if you don't have a good assessment system, you don't have the data really to show, that would result in 2 or more. And at this point, I think that if there are institutions out there without good assessment systems, without good data, they will definitely not be successful with the CAPE accreditation process, because that whole evidence and database, the culture of evidence is just so strong with CAPE now that it would lead to revocation at this point.
Okay, that helps very much.
Yeah, so I would say to institutions that are looking, out a few years from now on meeting the CAPE standards, the best place to put your time and attention is on that evidence and on your data and on your quality assurance system, because that will result in having the data that you need to pass component 3.2, which is on selectivity and admissions. And that was not a strong aspect. We didn't ask in the NCATE standards, at least, for evidence about the selectivity of candidates at admission. Okay, so that's kind of a new thing that I think people will have to develop if they haven't developed it already. Standard 5.3 and 5.4. Standard 5.4 relates almost directly, one-to-one correspondence to Standard 4 itself. And that's a whole new area of evidence collection, which is on your completers' effectiveness once they're out in the field. So I'd pay attention to, developing plans if you don't have state data, or if you're not able to get teacher effectiveness, let's say from the employers that have hired your teacher candidates. That would be a place to spend some time, too, because that may not be something that people have well developed. And then last of all, the Standard 5.3 is one that must be passed that talks about continuous improvement. Okay, how are you using this information to improve your programs, and how are you studying your innovations and your transformations on campus? Like if you're making changes, have you instituted processes for studying whether those changes have an impact or not? And so looking forward into not, the possibility of failing more than one standard, I'd pay attention to those particular components that could be high areas of risk.
And I'm curious, too, when you're speaking about getting the information from employers, I know we have quite a few institutions. I'm from California. We have quite a few institutions that do have employer surveys, and they do ask questions about how their candidates are doing in the field. The problem has been the low rate of response. Getting employers and principals and superintendents and different people to respond to this is almost like pulling teeth or bribery. What are you going to do to get them to respond? I'm curious if you've had others that have been more successful, perhaps?
Well, that's an excellent question, too. And, in fact, that's one of the drawbacks of surveys and something that CAPE has directly addressed. We'll talk about this briefly when we review the evidence guide next week, because one of the criteria for evaluating surveys is, have you identified processes for increasing the response rate? And then what interpretations can you really make from the employer surveys given your response rate? So, if you're dealing with 100 different institutions and you only have 10 responses, I mean, how much can you really say? And you need to take that into consideration reporting your results. In a recent survey, we will be doing a whole webinar on surveys, and a survey that I'm going to share with you as an example that we'll use to sort of critique, go through each one of those quality questions and look at it in relation to this particular survey. At the very end, in the beginning in their cover letter, they say, if you respond, when you finish responding to this survey, you're going to be directed to a page where you can register for a free family membership at X. Now, any EPP can fill in the X for, at the university gym, at, the university library, or at, if you have a partnership with a local museum, or Museum of Art or something like that, that would be a really wonderful way to sort of encourage responses outside of, physically putting it in a principal's hand and waiting until they finish it.
Sitting in the office and saying, I'll be here until you get it done.
It kind of kills the confidentiality.
Kind of does, doesn't it?
that we want to ensure as well. So, yes, so that's one thing that I have seen is to offer incentives. People have offered, Starbucks cards or, gift cards, $5 or whatever, get a free Starbucks.
It reminds me of my data collecting days in my dissertation. I did the same. Yeah, I understand.
Exactly. My dissertation, one of my members of my dissertation said the best part about getting a doctorate was that it taught you to think on your knees. And yeah, it's kind of like that. The best part of a employer survey is getting on your knees and begging people to respond.
Yes.
So thank you for your questions. I appreciate it. I hate to just sit here and talk to myself.
Well, and I don't know if this is a proper question to ask here. It's probably outside of this realm, and so if someone else has a question, I'll stop. But I was curious, the procedure now for becoming involved in CAPE and in all of the reviews, and how has that changed, or has it, and how do we direct our folks in the field to become involved in CAPE more?
Great question, too. Yes, there is a new process for that. It's called the online volunteer process. CAPE issued a call for nominations. I believe it was in February. Unfortunately, that process just closed down. The last day to submit your application for consideration was on Friday last week.
Oh.
Yeah, and so here's what. It happens every year right after January, okay? And so keep your eye on the CAPE website. Usually right on the top, the top few where they put all the most recent information, that sort of home page of the CAPE website will offer the announcement, and there's a place to click on to go into the system to register yourself. You can also find it, there's a tab that you pull down that talks about volunteers, and that'll get you there as well. But there's now a nomination committee that's part of the board of directors. You go into this online system, you tell them what role you're interested in playing, and it goes from, reviewing annual reports to reviewing assessments as part of the early review of instruments, to becoming a site visitor, to serving on one of the CAPE governance boards, okay, or governance structures. So you go in there, you upload, what you're interested in, you upload a copy of your CV, and answer a few other questions about, your perspective on the CAPE mission and vision, and how you see that that's an important part of your willingness to engage in these roles. And then the nomination committee takes all of that, and they make a roster of recommendations. They also take into consideration, because it is still a part of the process, that professional associations and organizations can recommend you, okay? And if they do, they'll ask you to go in to the volunteer system and upload your credentials. So they're all in there. But then you come forward, and as part of that application process, you do identify the particular organizations you belong to. And so as the nomination committee looks across, let's say, the 30 people that want to serve on the CAPE International Committee, they'll look across their experiences and who they represent. What geographic region do they represent? What's the diversity that they might represent? What organizations do they represent or could be a voice for? And then the nominating committee puts together a slate of recommendations that are then taken to the board of directors. So that's how the process goes now. So I would tell people to go in right now and take a look at that process, even though it's closed currently. Just check it out and maybe put a reminder on your own calendar that, February 1st or January 31st, start checking the website for when that's going to go up again.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I'm done with my questions.
Well, Carolyn, you're the only one who raised your hand. So
great.
And there are no other questions in the chat. Okay, everybody, unless we get another question in the next 15 seconds, we're going to call it a day, and I hope that you'll join us again in just a few days, April 1st at 5 p.m. I know it's April Fool's Day. I promise I won't look at the evidence guide in that light. Ha-ha, just fooling. We will to the evidence guide just like we did today and have an opportunity for lots of questions. So I look forward to seeing you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.